today's episode of How We Change the World, I'm honored to welcome Leah Rothstein, who has committed her life to social justice. Leah is focused now on addressing the entrenched issues of segregation and discrimination toward African American communities in our country. Leah, alongside her father, Richard Rothstein, co-authored the book Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation, Enacted under the Color of Law. And it is a truly groundbreaking work that offers this detailed map for confronting and dismantling these barriers that were created by government laws and policies that most of us have no idea existed. Leah provides examples of these laws enacted at every level of government from the 1930s throughout the 1950s that actively segregated white and black populations. And this is nearly a century after slavery ended. With that segregation, though, they also segregated black communities from resources. Leah talks about the many negative outcomes that those policies have had, leading to tenacious issues facing black communities today. Fortunately, it doesn't end there. Leah also offers actionable strategies for fostering a more equitable society. And so now here is my critically important conversation with Leah Rothstein, a true embodiment of the change that we aspire to see in the world. Leah Rothstein, hello, and welcome to How We Change the World podcast.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
I am so happy to have you here. I spoke just for a second before we started recording about how excited I am to have you specifically on the program. I'm excited for every guest. I always am, or I wouldn't have them on the program. But, you know, every once in a while, this person comes along who actually is the definition of what this show is about, which is how to change the world. And you have lived your life and also written a book, which the book specifically spells out how to change the world, a certain aspect of that world, which is kind of unusual, or highly unusual, I will say. And that the topic that we're talking about is segregation and discrimination towards African American communities specifically. Well, although not entirely unique, it's unique in certain ways that we'll talk about. You know, how that shows up in housing and how housing and where we live and the neighborhoods we live in, type of housing and all of it, really turns out to be a predominant player in the quality of life in so many different ways, which I'm sure you will also talk about. So it's, you're not Black, I don't think. Which is a question that we'll talk about. Not that one has to be a certain, I mean, not that that's a thing, but people will be curious why this has drawn you in so much to the level that you've really devoted so much of your life to it. So that's kind of the backdrop for where we're starting. Just before we go on, the name of the book, I don't always hold up the book, but I just love this cover so much. I love the graphic. It says Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation, Enacted under the Color of Law, which you wrote with your father, Richard Rothstein. And I love that graphic because it's really showing the maps of cities inside the graphic. So that's why I held it up. It's a very cool cover, and get your attention. And so does the title, which I'd like you to explain too, which is Enacted under the Color of Law. That's a unique turn of phrase. So I'm really curious about what that means. So, not a light topic, is it?
Not really.
Yeah.
But important.
It's so important, and the timing is interesting. There's just very many interesting things about it. So let's start by getting to know who you are. I know you live in Oakland now, and I know you got your master's in public administration from Berkeley. But could you tell us basically a little bit just more about maybe your backstory, how you sort of developed this type of a passion, and what kind of how your work has maybe led into that over these last couple decades, I believe.
Sure. Well, I think it has to start with my parents. Both of my parents are lifelong activists. Both were very active in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. My mom in the early feminist movement. They were very active sort of participants in our country and our democracy and
Very cool.
in trying to make it better, make our society more equitable and just. And so I grew up sort of around that as like, that's what you do. You see something that is wrong in your community and you try to make it better.
Okay.
And so it took me a while to understand that that was unique, that not everybody sort of grew up with their parents going to demonstrations or taking them to picket lines.
Very few, actually.
Right. It took
Most
me a while
people are focused on just their lives and surviving, you know.
Right.
It's not terribly unusual, but it's definitely more rare. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, it was just the job they went to like anybody else's parents, but their job happened to be, you know, working for a union or working for local government or, you know, in some capacity of trying to like improve the community. So I grew up with that understanding that sort of we have not only an obligation or like a responsibility to improve the things around us that we see should be improved,
right.
But also that there are ways to do that. You know, I saw my parents both working towards change and being successful. You know, there were avenues to use your own time and resources and skills to actually make change that could work. So I grew up both with like the idea that that's something I should do and that it's something that's possible to have an impact.
But that second part of that is the biggest part of that story.
Yeah.
Which is a part we don't get often.
Right. I think it's so often that we might look around and see, oh, there's so much wrong that I wish I could change, but I can't. You know, I'm powerless in the face of all of these.
It's too big. It's too big.
Yeah.
Or too hard or too intractable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see. I went to college. I had the idea as a kid because, you know, knowing my parents' story, their life stories, they went to college and became civil rights activists and joined the civil rights movement. And, you know, that changed the trajectory of their lives. So I sort of figured when I went to college, there would be a massive social movement for me to jump into.
Yeah.
And I got there and realized, oh, that's not how it works. You know, you have to build the movement you want to see. So I got involved in some campus organizing here in California around defending affirmative action when that was on the ballot here to outlaw affirmative action programs in the state. And so I started working on those issues as an undergrad.
Okay.
And then went on to then take some time off of my schooling to be a full-time organizer to work on those issues. And then from there, just sort of kept building on that, working as a community organizer, then a labor organizer, and then going back to school to get my master's in public policy so I could have sort of a bigger impact on the issues I was concerned with.
Are you a natural leader? Is that part of your, do you feel that that's your personality or just what you've sort of chosen as the necessary or recognized as a necessary skill? Because being an organizer at that young age says something about you.
Yeah, I never thought of myself as a natural leader, actually. This role I'm in now, writing a book and speaking about it, is sort of the most publicly facing work I've ever done. A lot of organizing is helping other people become leaders.
I see.
And that's what I like, sort of being a part of a team of the solution, but I don't necessarily want to be in the front of it.
Yeah. Well, I remember at the very beginning of starting this podcast, I put a video and I don't know if no one ever commented, and I thought it was so powerful. It's this very old video from TED, like TEDx, TED Talks, but just a short little one. And it's a whole video about these people dancing on the side of a hill. I know I'm going off on a wild hair here, but it seems relevant. And they're at a concert or something, outside of a concert, I think, listening to it. And somebody gets up and starts dancing, really kind of goofy to this music. And everyone's kind of laughing at this one individual dancing on this mountain, on this hillside. And then finally, one other person gets up and goes over and joins him. And, you can imagine then eventually it's more cool or acceptable to be up dancing than the only one sitting. So you see this sort of little mini movement start. And the point of the speaker talking about it, his point was that it's the second person, or that, it's not always the first person who stands up, because you're just one person doing nothing really. And it's the first follower and the early followers who actually make it a movement. So that's always resonated with me, and kind of similar to what you're describing about yourself in a way.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
you don't have to be the first person to be effective.
You don't, and in fact, if one person by themselves can't do anything really. We think we can, but we can't do much. Right. But sometimes you can write a book, and that can do it. When did you come to the decision to write this book, Just Action, about this topic?
Yeah, after my time working as an organizer and going back to school, then I worked in the sort of affordable housing community development field. I was a consultant to affordable housing developers in cities and counties, and really got my sort of knowledge of housing policy through that work. And was working for local governments, and then for a while, I worked in the local county governments here where I live on reforming community corrections systems to be more preventative and less punitive. And that's when my dad wrote his book, The Color of Law, in 2017. And I think we'll get into that in a minute. But his book was, it's the history of how we came to be a segregated country. And it outlines all of the laws and policies and government actions that were taken to ensure that we created and sustained a segregated society. And that book was really impactful. And, we have an idea in this country, or it was more widespread before The Color of Law came out, that we're segregated sort of by accident, or what's called de facto segregation, that it's just private actors or personal preference or an accidental sort of natural occurrence. It's not caused by laws or policies.
Well, but also including, we have also known that there were policies like Jim Crow, or there was official and legal segregation. But that's as far as we thought, right? Like schools were segregated, buses were segregated.
Right.
So there was some law.
Right. There was some law, and we thought it was limited to the South. There were laws that created, segregation in the South of schools and lunch counters and buses. And then we changed those laws. And so the segregation that remains in our neighborhoods all over the country, is something different. That's what we told ourselves. It's not laws. It's, we like to live around people who look like us, or it's realtors who were, bigoted and wouldn't sell homes to
pretty isolated little things, right?
Yeah. Private actors, and we can't do anything about it because it happened by accident. And so The Color of Law really debunked that myth and showed that it was government policy at all levels, explicit, intentional government policy to create, to ensure that we created and maintained segregated communities, particularly the segregation of African Americans from whites. And that book was very impactful in the country. It came out in 2017. Then we had 2020 and George Floyd's murder and racial sort of reckoning in this country. And it had a platform. People were interested, and sort of changed the conversation somewhat about how we came to be a segregated country. And, a lot of people who read The Color of Law, including myself, asked my dad afterwards, it's really amazing to see all this history laid out. It's really important that we reckon with the true history of how we got here. But now what do we do about it?
Right.
I didn't know. I felt, even with my housing policy background, it feels like segregation is just the water we swim in the United States. How can we ever change it? And so he eventually asked me to help him answer that question. He got that question enough times.
Oh, did he? Yeah.
He realized he sort of had to help answer it. And so he asked me to help him. And eventually I
see.
agreed.
I
That's
see.
how it came to be.
Yeah. The timing is also interesting too with Black Lives Matter. And, it just literally fed right into that time frame when his book came out in 2017. And then 3 years later, we're in the middle of, as you say, reckoning. Sort of a semi-reckoning, because we haven't really, your book is almost more of a reckoning, because you can't just, you have to do something to have a reckoning, I guess. Not just become aware of it. But I just want to ask a question about his book. I haven't read it, to be very honest, and I have it. They sent it to me, and I wanted to start with yours because I'm speaking to you, but I'm literally, cannot wait to go back and read it in depth, because I don't understand how this 2017 is now, basically. And we've been talking about this for 100 years. So how is it that we haven't known? Because honestly, even as a very open-minded, loving to participate and want to know more about this, I had some skepticism when I said that the government at all levels, when I read this, had, in your book, is implicated, that they literally had laws that created, the suburbs and on the books. No one's hiding it. How did we not know about this until this is the first I've heard of this, other than the law, what we talked about already?
Yeah.
Why?
Well,
was it in hiding?
It wasn't. The subtitle of The Color of Law is A Forgotten History of how the government
That's a generous title.
Segregated America. Yeah.
Forgotten or
forgotten. It wasn't hidden at the time. It wasn't. It wasn't. They weren't trying to be tricky about it or, slide it and get under the radar. They were very explicit, and we've just since forgotten that happened that way. And I'll give a couple examples. So, in the mid 20th century, after World War II, we weren't a suburban country. Most people lived in urban centers near where jobs were, factories that had to be near ports and rail lines and the businesses that supported those factories. After World War II, millions of war veterans came home. They started families. We had the baby boom. And there was a housing shortage because there wasn't a lot of housing built during the war or prior to the war in the Great Depression. And so these families couldn't find homes, and the federal government wanted to step in to meet the demand for housing. Right. And it did so by creating suburbs all over the country. So from a non-suburban society to a suburban society, now we're a very suburban country, that happened through government intervention.
And this is in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s?
Late 40s, early 50s.
Okay.
Yeah. So there were developers, like an example from The Color of Law is Levittown, which was outside of New York City on Long Island. It didn't, nothing really, people didn't live out there much. It was very rural. William Levitt wanted to build this suburb of 17,000 homes to meet the demand for workers in New York City for housing. And, he couldn't finance 17,000 homes himself. He couldn't get a bank loan because it seemed very speculative. There weren't people living there. The only way he could build it was by a federally backed loan guarantee from the Federal Housing Administration. Now, the Federal Housing Administration gave William Levitt this benefit of a federally backed loan so he could build Levittown on the condition that he put a covenant in the deeds of the homes he built saying that the homes could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. And this was,
it's jaw-dropping. It's jaw-dropping.
Yeah. This was written into the Federal Housing Administration manual. They had appraisers going out around the country to decide which subdivisions and suburbs the federal government would help finance. And the conditions were that the homes had to have these restrictive covenants in them, and that even the developments couldn't even be located near where African Americans lived because, and it said in the manual, the quote is, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So very explicitly creating suburbs for whites, intentionally very separate from where blacks lived.
Does that inharmonious, say that sentence again. I that confused me when I heard it before. Inharmonious racial groups. Are they saying inharmonious with each other, or are they saying that African Americans were inharmonious within just as human beings? Or do you know?
I think the implication might be the latter, but what they were trying to say is that mixing races was inharmonious, that races
Okay,
shouldn't live together in the same neighborhood. There's even in The Color of Law a photograph from Detroit of a 6-foot high, half-mile long wall that the Federal Housing Administration made a developer build in between his development and a nearby African-American neighborhood. He had to build that wall in order to get the federal subsidy to build his subdivision. So
I don't think any very, very few Americans are aware of a wall between. I mean, we see this somewhere else. We don't see it here.
Yeah.
And this is just, I don't know. I don't even think there's words. And I'm going to interrupt you just for a little bit of a commentary from you.
Sure.
What is this really about? Because because you do mention, there are many marginalized communities in this country that are not necessarily African American. They're Hispanic, or they're Native American, or they're Asian, or they're from other countries. They're new arrivals, which has always happened. What is the focus? But there has been a specific laws against African Americans. And honestly, I don't get it, because what it kind of hits me, and I know that I was taking us into another subject. I won't go too far off this, but you don't do that with people that you're not concerned are going to be some kind of a power, or if you feel that people will on their own destroy themselves or won't be a threat because they're not productive, or whatever the thinking was, then you don't make laws around it. So what were they really afraid of? Or do you know? That's maybe an unfair question to put to you, because it's not what your specialty is.
Yeah, I can't say I really know, but I can speculate that, after slavery in this country, I imagine that those in power were afraid of allowing African Americans to have enough power to sort of respond to all of their time as slaves. We oppressed this race of people for so long.
Interesting.
And I think a lot of the sort of impetus for segregating the whole country came from, it started in the South, Jim Crow, and it spread, and I can't exactly say why, except that it came from a very long history in this country of oppressing African Americans and ensuring they don't have.
Did this happen around the whole country?
This happened all over the country.
Same thing, same law.
Federal
housing.
The restrictive covenants had different language in different parts of the country, but they all had the same impact. Only whites could buy these homes, occupy them. Now, those restrictive covenants, and at some point became illegal or non-enforceable. They were still used, challenged, but still used as long as they could get away with it. And they still remain on the deeds of homes, even though they're no longer legally enforceable. So a lot of communities have started sort of their actions around challenging segregation by discovering these restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes and starting to, investigate. Oh my gosh, this is how intentionally my own home was segregated. I had no idea this happened here. How common was it? What can we do about this? And if I may, continue.
Please continue.
The Levittown example, again, just one example of many, many, many all across the country. But in Levittown, so the homes in the suburbs that were created with the help of the federal government, they were affordable to working families. They cost about $100,000 in today's money. That's a very affordable
in today's
home price.
money. Okay. Yeah.
And so they were subsidized to be affordable. And then the home buyers could also get federally backed mortgages from the FHA or the Veterans Administration. If they were white, they could get these mortgages. So they were subsidized on both ends. They got into home ownership. It was affordable. They didn't, they bought a home because they needed a home. They didn't expect it to make them rich. That's not how it worked at the time. That's
right.
Since what home ownership has become, but it's not what it was seen as then. But that's what happened. So homes in suburbs like Levittown, they don't sell for $100,000 anymore. The median home price in Levittown today is about $600,000. And in a lot of suburbs, it's about that, 400, 500, 600,000, some places
Easy.
$1 million or more.
Yeah, it is in Denver where I live. I mean, they're all $1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, close.
So the families who bought them when they were affordable, they gained exponential wealth in that experience that they could then use to send their kids to college, to weather health emergencies, or enjoy their own retirement. And most importantly, to pass down wealth to their kids and grandkids to buy their own homes. So these restrictive covenants no longer legally enforceable. We now have the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 that says you can't discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. But it's sort of an empty promise when homes come up for sale in Levittown for $600,000. White home buyers are far more likely to have intergenerational wealth to afford that home. African-American families don't have that wealth. They actually, on average, have 5% of the wealth of white families.
5% of the, when you say wealth, you're not talking maybe current salary or anything like that. You're saying.
Yeah, salary income is different. The income gap is about 60%. Average household income of Blacks is 60% of white household income.
Okay.
Also, a disparity that we should be concerned with. But you would think the wealth disparity would be about the same. But the wealth disparity is way larger, 5%. And that's because most Americans, a lot of their wealth is in their home.
Okay.
And African Americans have been explicitly prohibited from getting into home ownership when it was affordable, and now can't afford to because they don't have that intergenerational wealth. So that's why these segregative patterns, even though the policies were enacted, a century ago, and have since been changed or are no longer enforceable, we live with the consequences of those. They're hard to change without intentional action.
All right. It's really a hard story, because we hear about it. We hear about legacy and, how, and the systemic racism, and we hear about it in so many different ways. I used to be in the 90s. I was a diversity trainer. I learned about many, many of these things. But this is the nut of it, it seems to me. Can you talk about what that has wrought? I mean, because it is throughout society now, and it's been sort of invisible. The repercussions I'm talking about. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
The repercussions of this housing split and this lack of generational wealth, because what you describe, you say that when they segregated housing, they also segregated resources. That's the point.
Yeah. When we talk about racial segregation, we're not just talking about a benign separation of people where some people live here and some people live here and all else is equal. The same policies that created segregation ensured that where whites could live were areas that had, well-resourced public schools, open space, clean air, access to jobs and transportation. Whereas the neighborhoods where African Americans were limited to living in, closer to freeways with pollution, older homes with lead paint, no open space or clean air, fewer grocery stores selling fresh food, fewer bank branches, the public schools in these areas overwhelmed with the students coming to school with challenges as a result of living in that neighborhood. Asthma, if you're up all night wheezing, it's harder to concentrate in school. So no matter how well, qualified all the teachers in the school are, they'll be overwhelmed by a classroom full of children who come to school with one of these challenges, a health challenge or stress, or parents who work 3 jobs, or, come to school hungry, or come to school walking through sort of a violent neighborhood and come to school with a lot of stress. So the segregation of our neighborhoods, it's a segregation of resources, it's a segregation of opportunity, and it really determines a lot of our life outcomes. So as a result of segregated
all of them
neighborhoods,
almost.
it underlies all of our serious social problems and most serious racial disparities.
Because it's the outlier in a neighborhood like that that can become the Obama. That's an outlier. People, we had a black president. Yeah, we had a black president. It's amazing how people thought it's fixed then.
Yeah, right. Yeah, children who grow up in segregated African American neighborhoods, they grow up to, have lower incomes than white children who grow up in white neighborhoods, lower educational outcomes and achievement, and their health outcomes are worse. So they have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and shorter life expectancies. And I think that, to me, is, oh my gosh, we're determining the quality of life by where we live that we get for our whole lives and how long we can live. And those are real consequences.
Yeah, they're a lot. That's everything, really. I mean, it's a quality of life and how long it is. That's what we all strive for. That is the thing.
Yeah.
These two events that have come along, which have been COVID and what's the other one? I guess COVID and what happened with Black Lives Matter. Those two things coincided, and they both shone a light on the disparity, because that's when we start, like with COVID, we started seeing the impact of COVID on Black lives. I don't know the figures. I don't know if you know, but I mean, how many more people percentage-wise died were African American because of the pre-existing conditions? But then, has anything changed? What we've seen almost is less action, because we've seen affirmative action struck down by the Supreme Court, and other, there's been other developments, other legal challenges that have not improved it once we've all seen it a little bit, but went the other direction. These events of COVID and Black Lives Matter seem to not be having the effect that they should be having.
I mean, that's part of why we wrote the book, because 20 million people came out for these Black Lives Matter demonstrations. More people than have ever marched for racial justice in this country.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that.
People of all types, from urban, suburban areas, all races, ages.
And during a pandemic, nonetheless.
And during a pandemic. Yeah. And then, many of them went home, maybe put a lawn sign on their front lawn, or maybe started a book club and read about racial justice, or they went back to their companies and, started DEI initiatives or issued letters to their shareholders saying, racism is bad and we'll do better.
Yeah.
But those are all somewhat performative. They're good to raise awareness, all of these actions, but they don't change anything. And we thought maybe one of the reasons is because people didn't know how to affect change, what they could do.
Yeah.
And so we wrote this book for those 20 million people to say, look, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, here are things you can do in your own community that will actually make Black Lives Matter and actually address the disparities that we're concerned about.
What's been the response from the African American community to your book?
It's been very positive. And I think, I've gotten a lot of comments that it's nice to hear someone that isn't Black talking about these issues. They get tired of having to explain segregation and racism and discrimination. Yeah, so I think it's been very positive and hopeful.
Okay.
The color of law, had a real impact. A lot of people, particularly African Americans who read that book, I've heard tell me that they knew this, they experienced this history, but they hadn't seen it written down. They didn't know how, explicit it was. And so it was validating to read that their experience, was proven that this was really happening, and that that their experience of sort of having a harder time accessing opportunity and succeeding, that it's not their fault, that there were all of these obstacles put in their way. And I think that is also validating to just see written down.
Which your book does as well. I mean, because there has been talk about systemic racism and impacts and prison and, but it hasn't sunk in. It just has only sunk in among, and I'm kind of happy to hear you say, or I don't know, happy, but it's clarifying to hear you say that you're talking to those 20 million white, I guess not, I don't know if there's 20 million of them were white, but people who marched and were really concerned about Black Lives Matter. Because I was curious, with all the things on our plate right now in the world, how do we get people re-interested in this at a time when it seems to be not front and center? And that's why I love that your book came out, because things kind of go in waves, and things become almost in fashion. Let's all go do Black Lives Matter. Now let's all go do Ukraine, or, the war in Israel, or environment. It's weird that causes become sort of
trendy.
Yeah. And this is not trendy right now. It's the opposite of trendy, because it was, and now and this is the time, and we can't let it go, because the impacts.
It may not be trendy, but it is obviously essential, or maybe not obviously, but that's what we try to explain, that if we want a more equal society, if we want to address these disparities that exist, and sort of the way our country is limited in a lot of ways by keeping people apart. It's better for all of us when we're more integrated socially, economically, that we know people of different races, that we work with people of different races, that we know how to, interact and work with other people, that people are allowed to move freely where they want to live in the country for the best jobs. That helps our economy. So there's all of these ways that it's better for all of us to break down these obstacles. And that I think that it's also important. So in Just Action, we give all of these examples of strategies that people can take on the local level to affect change. And we were very intentional to keep it to local policy change, because it's feasible. We can actually, national politics are what they are right now. Feels hard to get an in there on any issue. But locally, we can actually make really significant changes that have significant impacts on the segregation of our communities. And there's communities doing this all over the country. So we give a lot of examples of communities that are successfully implementing these changes, because I think it's important, to know that this is feasible. There's something we can do that will have an impact, and that it's happening, that people are doing this and having success. And so there's hope. And I think both of those things are necessary to motivate people and keep people in action around it.
Yeah. And you must have read my mind, because the question that I was going to ask is, isn't this just as good for everyone? It's not, we're not just, and it's always that case, right? When you lift up any kind of person who's in distress, it lifts everyone up, and it's not a zero-sum game, I guess.
Yeah.
We're not investing money in poverty-stricken communities by taking it away from other people. It just it helps us all. No one likes crime. No one likes any of no one likes to drive by us or hear about or anything that there's such a disparity. It pulls us all down, and it doesn't make us feel good about our country, and it divides us. So this has to be beneficial for everyone. So let's talk. And you're right that trying to make any change at the federal level, really on anything now, is sort of just let's not waste our time and our energy. Let's go to where the change can happen.
Right.
So so let's talk about some of the interesting things, and it's around housing, much of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Most of it is
or maybe
around
all
housing.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are some of the ideas that you have that can make change in a local community that we can all work towards?
Yeah. Well, we break it down into a couple of categories of strategies. The first one are strategies that increase resources and investments in lower income segregated Black neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods have been deprived of resources as a result of segregation. So to remedy segregation, we want to make those neighborhoods, areas of higher opportunity, better access to opportunity and resources. And we know that when that happens, often people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in those neighborhoods as they become better resourced.
Right.
And gentrification occurs and the prices go up and longtime residents are forced out. And so we couple those sort of strategies to increase investments with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur because of gentrification. So these include things like an inclusionary zoning policy, which is a policy adopted by a local planning commission or city council that requires that when new housing is built, a certain percentage of the units have to be affordable to lower or moderate income households. So in a gentrifying community, often there's a lot of new market rate housing coming in. If you can ensure that some of those units will be affordable and go towards the residents who are at risk of displacement from that neighborhood, that's one way of ensuring that some displacement is prevented. We can also protect renters from rapidly increasing rents or unjust evictions that often happen in gentrifying communities. Provide them with free legal representation when they're facing an eviction. Through a right to counsel program. We can also support community land trusts, and community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that create permanently affordable homeownership opportunities, often in gentrifying communities where housing costs are going up. They acquire land, they retain ownership of the land underneath the home and sell the home at an affordable price. And because they retain ownership of the land, they can ensure that the home buyer, when they want to resell the home, they have to resell it at an affordable price. So it's a permanently affordable home in communities where housing prices are rising rapidly. It's a way of ensuring that there's still home ownership opportunities for people in that community. And then the other category of strategies we talk about are concerned with opening up suburban, exclusive, expensive communities to more diverse residents. So we have to do both of these things. And
opening
we can
them up in what way? I mean,
how do we do that?
Yeah.
Well, a number of ways. We can change the zoning codes in those communities because many of these suburban communities, they have what's called single family only zoning. Single family only zoning means that on every lot in that community, you can only build one house. And sometimes, it even says the lots have to be a minimum of this size. So it ensures there's large lots and large homes. Single family only zoning came about to replace racialized zoning when that became illegal. It used to be that cities would zone their residential areas by race. And when that became illegal, cities started zoning for single family only homes in an area. And when you have single family only zoning, it ensures that you can't build enough housing to meet the demand. The
price goes up.
Supply is capped, so the prices stay high. So it's a way of ensuring that only the most affluent can afford those homes, which are more likely to be white people. And so it was a way of ensuring that African Americans couldn't buy into these communities. So we have to start by changing the zoning to allow more housing to be built. And this is also important, not just for desegregating suburbs, but for meeting our housing affordability crisis and housing supply crisis right now. One of the reasons we're in that crisis is because we've zoned for single family only homes and we haven't allowed the market to meet the demand. So a lot of communities are rezoning, allowing duplexes, triplexes, small multifamily buildings instead of just one home. And then we advocate for then having priorities or preferences or intentions put on those new homes built to ensure that people who've historically been excluded from these communities have access to those homes. We can also do that through subsidies, down payment assistance subsidies for African American families who lack down payment funds because they don't have the intergenerational wealth that whites do because of past government policies. rental subsidies to help people be able to rent in these high cost communities. So those are some examples. And then we also have sort of a category of strategies that have to do with just increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in all kinds of communities, and then ensuring that the home ownership experience for them is actually a wealth building experience. There's a lot of ways that even once they're into home ownership, the wealth building potential of home ownership for African Americans is limited compared to whites. There's still sort of discrepancies that exist in the home ownership experience that have to be addressed.
Maybe because of financial constraints.
Financial constraints.
Being able to maintain the quality of the house. So if you can barely afford a house, it's hard to maintain it as well, as many people have learned.
Yeah, that's right.
You just scrape into it. Yeah.
And there's also, in communities all over the country, African Americans are overpaying in property taxes relative to the value of their house. They're paying more than their fair share in property taxes.
And getting less in terms of schooling and resources.
Well, it's actually because of how the property assessment process works. So local county assessor, they determine a property tax rate that's applied to every home. It's a percentage applied to the home value of every home in the jurisdiction, the assessed value of the home. That assessed value is supposed to be as close to its market value as possible.
Right.
But you can't know a home's true market value unless it's sold that year. So they create a system to estimate what that market value is. And then in many jurisdictions, they don't do those. Their systems aren't very good. And then they don't do frequent reassessments. So instead of doing a real reassessment of all of the property values, they'll take their base assessed value and adjust it a little bit every year based on how they think the housing market is doing.
Okay.
Now, in that time, homes in white areas, they appreciate in value. Their values go up a lot faster than those adjustments. And homes in African American communities don't go up as fast, the value of those homes. And so they're paying closer to their assessed value is closer to the market value of their home in Black communities. And in white communities, the assessed value is far below the market value of their home. So whites are underpaying in property taxes. Blacks are overpaying. If you're overpaying in property taxes, it's harder to maintain your home. It's harder to build wealth through that home ownership experience because you're spending more.
Well, and also when you have 60% of the salary of a white person, you're never going to be able to, it's going to take generations before you can be on par. If that. This is so insidious. When you look at this system, was this all work that are these all facts and insights that you have gleaned from your work, or was this research from the book, or are these just known by everyone?
It's a mix.
Putting it all together.
Yeah, it's a mix of things. Some of the topics I knew about, this property tax issue I didn't know about until we researched the book. Very little. I think there's maybe one or two things in the book that were our original ideas. Everything else, there are people working on this. It's not, a secret or rocket science. We know what the problems are. That knowledge is out there. We know how to fix it. It just hasn't all been put together in one place. So that's what our work on this book was, finding all of that information.
I see.
Explaining it in a way that we hope is easy to understand and putting it all in one place. There's a lot of academics that work on just this property tax issue or just this one issue, but there's not a lot of places where you can see it all in one place.
It kind of, there's some parallels with environmental protection movement, that we know the solutions. We haven't always known solutions, and scientists are working on certain things and they know them really well, but the rest of us haven't had it all put together, or we've ignored it. And I guess the ignoring of it is more my concern with this issue. So you named a lot of very pragmatic and compelling ways to make change. And I know part of this answer because of the book, but just like the environmental, we know fossil fuels, we know a lot of things that people are not willing to do. And that is stopping us. I mean, that is a hard stop on progress. I mean, at the peril of all of us, clearly. So how do you propose to get hearts and minds changed? Like, for example, one of the things you mentioned was changing the zoning in a suburb. Not easy. I'm thinking of some of the suburbs that I know in Denver, and let's come in and rezone and take your $3 million house, and now the value is likely to go. And people protect their economic, which is what happened in the environment. People protect their economic investments, like a mother bear with her cubs. They do not give in. They fight before they give in.
Well, yeah, none of this is necessarily easy. It takes organizing and talking to people and, explaining the facts. And the fact is that when you rezone an area, your property value doesn't go down. It might even go up, because now your lot, if you wanted to tear down your home, you could build 3 homes.
Right.
Yeah. And so a lot of people, we have this myth that any changes to our community are detrimental to our financial situation.
It's just a reaction. It's an immediate reaction. Yeah.
Because of how our communities have been created to protect our, the wealth of people in suburbs by keeping other people out. And we've really adopted that as fact. When communities integrated, property values go up because there's more people who want to live there. Because you're not excluding a good proportion of the population. Now everyone wants to live there, property values go up. And so we have to dispel these myths, talk to our neighbors, do, the hard work of organizing around these issues. And often, people in suburban communities, when they learn about the history of why, it's zoned that way, why the community looks the way it does racially, they understand that these laws are, one in a long line of laws that have kept the community homogenous and exclusive. And these days, as communities have become so much more unaffordable, it impacts all of us, people who
definitely
whose children grow up, they can't come back to live in their community. Right. Teachers can't afford to live in their community.
Or firemen or policemen.
The policemen, firefighters. Unless we address this issue, it does impact all of us. And I think people are starting to see that. And it impacts, the climate issue. If we can't build where we already have infrastructure and homes, we're going to keep building farther out and need more time in the car. It impacts all of us to be smart about how we're doing this and to really challenge those ideas that any change is bad.
How do we affect that change? I mean, I understand, talking to our neighbors, it feels a little milquetoast, I have to say. I mean, doesn't it take some a full movement? I mean, are you trying to start a movement? Because this book could be, if this should be this information, whether in this book or some other way, in universities, in graduate schools, in government, I mean, it needs to be distributed in a way, because it's massive. You're talking about like a civil rights movement. You're talking about a massive, massive movement. You might have to become that leader that is, we're going to have to bring that out. And
that is what we're calling for, is an activated civil rights movement, but that starts, which most do, on the local level, with local groups working on these more incremental changes. And I'll give an example, if you don't mind, of how this could work, on the local level. So this is a story I wrote about. We have a Substack column called Just Action that we're continuing to write about, success stories or new issues or changes in what we wrote in the book about, because it's constantly changing. And
it's free, by the way. I just want to make sure that people know where to find it, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes so that people can find you easily, because it's some great stories in the
great. Thank you. Yeah. So I wrote about a story from Silicon Valley in California, very expensive community. Median home prices there, $3 million. This is
median.
Very expensive. And a group there read The Color of Law and decided they wanted to educate themselves and their neighbors about the history of their own region and how it came to be segregated and why they're in the housing crisis that they're in. So they developed a training called the Color of Law Menlo Park about their city, outlining all of the policies that created, the zoning, the segregation of their community. And they did it throughout the pandemic, online to all sorts of groups, parent groups, Rotary groups. And they started to educate and develop this understanding of, there's a reason our home prices are so high and our community looks the way it does. It's not just because we're more, the people who live here are more successful or more deserving of these homes. There's a reason it has happened this way. And in the midst of this they were building an organization around housing in their community based on this understanding of the history. In their community, home prices were very high. Teachers, 30% of the teachers in the local school district moved away, left their jobs every year because they couldn't find housing they could afford. So this was impacting their lives, their kids, schooling. And so a local school district had some vacant land in their city and proposed to build 90 units of housing for teachers, affordable teacher housing. It would be an upzoning, changing the zoning of that lot to allow 90 units. And some neighbors opposed it, but for the reasons you said, afraid of the changes in their neighborhood and what it would do. And so they put a measure on the ballot that would have blocked this development and basically blocked any future multifamily development. It said any rezoning in the future of a single family lot would have to go before the voters. So made it very, very hard to build new housing. So this group that had been educating their neighbors about the history of segregation in their community, they understood that this measure was, one in a series of policies that would keep their community very white and very expensive. And so they launched a campaign to defeat it. They went door to door every weekend and they knocked on doors and talked to their neighbors. And, I talked to them. Many of the leaders of this campaign, they said they would go to a door and look at the house and think this person isn't going to be on our side, but knock on the door anyway.
Yeah, you don't know.
Talk to them. And often the person agreed because they said, I don't like what's happening here either. My kids can't move back. My favorite cafe is closing or reducing hours because they can't get any employees because they can't live near here. It's too expensive. So they were feeling the impacts of all of this and seeing how this measure related to that. And they defeated the measure. So it worked, this sort of there's always opposition, but there's also always support. And we have to just find it and activate it. And so the measure was defeated. The teacher housing will be built. There's, opportunity now for more housing in the future that, so, cool. And they're building an organization. Story. So if it can happen there, I think it can happen anywhere.
And that brings up such an important point, I think, is that just the way that people, we all tend to think certain things about people we don't know, or people, maybe we think how a Black person thinks or how a Hispanic person thinks, or, just because it's just it's just what human nature is. Yeah. But we do the same thing with white people, with other white people, like if we're white. And so we assume, these $600,000 or $6 million houses, or $3 million was the the average. They're not going to be interested in that. And then you go to, and that's not fair to them either. They may be, who knows what their story is and what their sensibilities and because we thought the same thing with Black Lives Matter. There's some very, neighborhoods in Denver that I'm thinking of that were filled with Black Lives Matter signs that are the most wealthy neighborhoods, old established neighborhoods, I don't know. And in the suburbs, we can't assume city people are one way. So we can't make assumptions, and it's part of our survival, but we have to at least be aware of our unexamined assumptions. We have to be aware of those, and that's half the battle.
And I agree. And then the best way to challenge them is to get to know other people, and start to see them as humans and understand what their hopes and dreams are. And it just breaks down whatever assumptions and stereotypes and biases we have.
Yeah. And, you mentioned, I think at the beginning of the book, maybe even in the intro, about how, both Black and white individuals wish they had a more diverse friend group. And we do, you see it. And sometimes you'll really see it when my sister-in-law is Black, and she, and of course my niece, and I remember going to a very white church on Easter with her up in the mountains, up in the foothills, which is all white in Denver, in Colorado. And, you would have thought I brought the Pope with me to this church, because everyone was doting on her and her, her infant. And it's like they want to be friends with Black people.
Yeah.
But they want it to be one Black person alone in their church who they can, it's not like they want to live in a Black neighborhood. So there's a curiosity, there's a desire, but there's also fear. There's so much work to be done.
Exactly. And I'll say that we start Just Action by saying that that's what we need to do, is to start to build these cross-race relationships that then we can use to advocate for change, use the relationships we build and our social connections. And we have to take intentional steps to build those relationships, because we live in segregated communities.
Yeah,
we don't
have to work
come in contact with each other. And so we give some stories. One is from a group of churches in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 6 Presbyterian congregations in the city. 3 were all white, 3 all Black. They wanted to start an interracial group, and so they created what they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, a group that had equal representation from the white churches and the Black churches. And they started conversations, got to know each other, started, to meet outside of their group meetings to get to know each other.
Yeah.
And ensured that they maintained equal representation of Blacks and whites. So when one person left the group, they were replaced by someone of the same race.
Important.
And then the group went on to advocate for, an African-American history curriculum in the school district. And they won that. They got a police review board adopted by the city. And then they started building Habitat for Humanity homes together. So
beautiful story.
These 6 congregations, they didn't know about each other before, even in the same denomination, type of church.
Yeah.
And so it takes some intentional steps, but it's not impossible. And it's an essential first step to then build the groups that we need to make these changes.
Because this is what you're suggesting, is that we start with these groups that will lead to committees, that will lead to local action, that will lead to city council meetings, and being able to go speak to your local representatives, and maybe your local banks, or your local everything. But that's beautiful. Well, we're out of time, a little bit out of time, but I could listen to you speak forever. And I was telling you before we came on that I've listened to a lot of you on YouTube, and I'm going to put some of those links on the on our website, on your page, because every time I hear you speak, I learn something new, and you really, something different, a different angle of this. We're just skimming the surface with this conversation. The book I can't recommend highly enough. And also your Substack, I barely got into that, but I'm going to go digging into that, and you really motivated me, I have to say. So,
well, thank you so much.
I hope others as well. I don't see how. I think you're a very strong leader. You just have your very, you're gentle, which is kind of nice, because nobody needs a leader like bonking them over the head.
Right.
So you're much more a leader than you realize. Thank you so much, and I just look forward to seeing where this goes.
Thank you. This was really a great conversation. It went by so fast.
It did. I know. Like, oh no, so many more things, but maybe that's a good place to stop wanting more. All right. Take care.
You too.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.